Today, we're going to start the reading of The Sacrament of Abortion by Ginette Paris. And it's a rather obscure text that was published in 1992. And quite a special one. The back of the book says, most women who choose abortion express their long-term maternal feeling. A child must be wanted, else its life is a living death. Women who abort see beyond the fetus to the true care that every child must have. Abortion, thus, becomes a sacrificial act. The author writes, issues of life and death, of love and children are religious. But what kind of religion? Those who favor abortion rationalize it as private and medical only. Their view omits religious feeling. At the other extreme, the pro-lifers see the spiritual dimension, but keep it imprisoned within the official orthodoxies, as if no other form of spirituality existed. What if my religious beliefs are pagan? This little book presents abortion as a sacrifice to Artemis, who refuses to give life if the gift is not pure. Her adamant stance shows each woman that other spiritual standards govern family and children than those dictated by laws, courts, medicine, and the narrow notions of religion. So let us begin. Ginette Paris's 1992 classic, The Sacrament of Abortion. Introduction, The Wild One. I have drawn inspiration throughout this book from a guiding image, the Artemis of Greek mythology, known to the Romans as Diana the Huntress. She is an untamed goddess, a champion of what we would think of today as ecological values. I have chosen her to enrich these reflections on abortion because her myth is full of what appear to be contradictory elements, the same kinds of contradictions that abound in considerations of abortion. Artemis is both a protector of wild animals and a hunter who kills them with unerring aim. How can the same divinity be the patron saint of hunters and the protector of animals? Greek women invoked her name during the pains of labor, but if a woman were to die or the infant could not survive, then a quick death considered preferable in Greek eyes to a long agony or a life of suffering was also attributed to Artemis. The same goddess thus offers protection and also death to women, children, and animals. Why these contradictions? Why are they personified in a feminine divinity? Is it a way of saying that a woman's protective power cannot function properly if she does not also possess in full power, namely the power over death as well as life? Her image belongs to us as well as to antiquity, because like all fundamental images of the human experience, which C.G. Jung calls archetypes, she never really ages but reappears in different forms and different symbols. So we may ask ourselves, what is happening today to this archetype who combines in such a paradoxical way the love of life and the acceptance of death? She encourages us to become more aware of the power of death and its inescapable nature and its necessary role in a living ecology. Abortion is about love, life, and death. Why go back to mythology? Mythology tells us what it's like to be human. We're all born to parents who become our principal divinities for a considerable period of our lives. Sooner or later, we all have to detach ourselves and take up our own struggle against the forces of evil. We're all confronted with the mystery of the other sex and the mystery of nature. We all have responsibility for the generation that preceded us and the one that is to follow. Towards the end, after a life full of adventures, inner and outer, we try to make sense of it all, but then we die. This is what mythology is all about, images and stories that symbolically represent what is universal in human life. It is an expression of how reality appears to us, not an explanation as science is. Mythology is so fundamental to humans that every culture, without exception, develops its own. Ours is expressed today throughout literature, film, television, advertising, fashion, song. It is revealed in the people we choose to honor, the celebrities that command our attention, in the economic, political, and cultural decisions we make. In short, mythology is to culture what dreams and symbols are to the individual. No one can survive without dreaming, awake or asleep, and no culture can endure without myths. This is what the mythologist Joseph Campbell meant when he said that a myth is a collective dream, whereas a dream is a personal myth. How can a myth be changed? We play many roles on the inner movie screen of our personal myth: hero and heroine, victim or savior, child or parent, shy maiden or brave knight, mother figure or old wise man. These are archetypal roles. That is, they are basic to our psychological being. Archetypes are at the foundation of every myth, personal or collective. They include ideas, emotions, attitudes, values, and behavior. C.G. Jung calls this entanglement of levels of a complex. These complexes or archetypes make up our basic scenarios. The proliferation of popular psychology books dealing with complexes of all kinds shows how hard we try to become aware of these scenarios so as to distance ourselves from roles that are no longer appropriate. Judeo-Christian mythology has had the major influence on our Western culture for over 2,000 years, providing ideas, values, and symbolic images. Can we erase 2,000 years of monotheistic influence by dropping all religious practice and declaring ourselves free from our parents' faith? Certainly not, as it has been proved by our own sudden awakening to ecological values. We are only beginning to understand how a religion, which strips nature from its sacredness so as to place everything sacred in one God, whose realm is not of this world, can be dangerous for trees, animals, oceans, forests, and body consciousness, all of which were considered receptacles for the divine in polytheistic antiquity. It's not that simple to leave Judeo-Christian mythology behind, because we have no idea to what extent it lingers in our subconscious notions of good and evil, in the choices we make, which on the surface have nothing to do with religion. It is still active in our most intimate emotional reactions, when feelings of anguish or guilt rise up suddenly without our knowing why. Our attitudes towards abortion are subconsciously stamped by Judeo-Christian values, even among those people who consider themselves completely liberated from them. We are now on the threshold of a liberalization of attitude towards abortion, in many ways comparable to the freeing up of sexual attitudes 30 years ago. When contraceptive methods became more widespread after World War II, it seemed like the end of the sexual repression in Victorian values. Sexual attitudes underwent a complete reversal, and a new myth appeared in films, in literature, and in advertising, in which women became more sensual and reclaimed the right to sexual pleasure without having their morality called into question. But women, and also the men who urged them on, found out that giving themselves permission was not enough to guarantee their pleasure. Relax and enjoy it was not that easy, even if that was precisely what they most wanted. It is a basic premise of psychotherapy that it is difficult to change any psychological reality as long as it remains unconscious. It controls us without our knowing it. Becoming aware of what controls us is the major key to healing in all therapeutic approaches. If women couldn't easily let themselves go, it was because of lingering unconscious prohibitions. The psychology of sexuality came a long way in a half century, partly because a great deal of attention was paid to it. Reproductive morality does not fascinate us in the same way that sexual morality does. Once contraceptives and then abortion became acceptable, we no longer gave reproductive matters much thought, and the result is that Judeo-Christian myth surrounding abortion is still with us, although on a more subconscious level. My use of pagan mythology in these pages is meant to provide contrast. When compared to the mythology of patriarchal monotheism, it shows that there is more than one way to define morality: human dignity, children's rights, and the collective responsibility for life and death issues. It's also clear that all of this is intimately connected with global ecology. I will now return to the pagans to highlight what is still Judeo-Christian within us. one among many. The choice of one goddess out of the incredibly rich assortment in Greek mythology requires an explanation. Why Artemis and not another? Many other divinities could be invoked in connection with ecology or abortion. Despite 20 years of acquaintance with these gods and goddesses of our pagan past, each time I put my attention on one alone, I feel uneasy. They're all important, especially the overall richness of their relationships. Each is part of a team, part of a never-ending group dynamic. Artemis, for example, has sisters, brothers, aunts, and uncles, all as important to the whole as she is. It was the Greeks' way of saying that reason, Apollo, is as important as emotion, Dionysos, that war, Ares, is ever present as love, Aphrodite, that a child needs a father, Zeus, and a mother, Demeter, that a husband needs a wife, Hera, and stability, Hestia, is as crucial as change, Hermes, and the sun, Apollo, needs a sister, the moon, Artemis. In short, that each divinity, each archetype represents a piece of human experience, and that makes no sense to wonder which, head or heart, heaven or earth, feminine or masculine, sun or moon, should dominate the other. Greek mythology is a complex system in which there is room for everyone and everything, as long as a certain equilibrium is maintained and certain territories are respected, symbolized by the battles of the love affairs of the gods. The divinities make love to create new principles. They struggle and oppose each other to delineate their zones of power and to preserve their rights. Their unbelievably petty quarrels represent the infighting that goes on in our own consciousnesses between opposing values. We too must juggle the same principles in the conduct of our own lives, and that's not an easy task. But it's impossible to deal with the whole pantheon at once. Sometimes at a party, we feel like moving off into a corner to pursue a conversation with one person. It's in that sense that I restrict myself here to speaking with Artemis, wanting to examine in depth her point of view, but with full respect for the others. This little book develops the idea that abortion is a sacred act and that an expression of maternal responsibility and not a failure of maternal love. If the issues surrounding life and death and children and love are not religious issues, or at least spiritual ones, what is left that is religious? But if we accept abortion as a religious act, then many questions arise. What sort of religion do we mean? Who defines it? What values does it represent? Judeo-Christian values, which may have seemed necessary, perhaps even redemptive some 2,000 years ago, now appear more irresponsible. And I will try to show how they are infinitely more cruel than abortion. What is a moral stand on reproduction worth if it doesn't take responsibility for the children born of a religious duty? What kind of pope, El Papa in Italian, invests in Wall Street instead of providing for the hungry and destitute? What kind of fundamentalist morality turns its back on the suffering of mothers and couples and children when babies arrive unwanted into this world? And above all, can we accept any kind of religious morality that has lost sight of the larger implications of a global ecology? A brief history of contraception and abortion. Women have always been concerned with limiting births, not only since overpopulation became a problem. Even in the most repressive societies, even at the risk of their lives, they found ways to practice contraception and abortion, which in fact have proved to be more of a religious problem than a technical one. In the beginning of civilization, the Hebrews had already discovered the fertile days of a woman's cycle, using that knowledge to increase fertility. In Greece, the priest physicians in Hippocrates' school of medicine had to take a solemn oath, the famous Hippocratic oath, not to provide any woman with the abortion pessary. That tells us that abortion pessaries existed and that women had to ask someone other than a doctor to get one. In Imperial Rome, a commentary by Juvenal reveals that then, as now, Abortion was easy for rich women to obtain and difficult for poor women. The common women, at least, accept the dangers of childbirth and the fatigue of nursing an infant. Their poverty obliges them to, but on the gilded beds, scarcely a woman in labor is to be seen. Such is the effectiveness of procedures and drugs that make women sterile and kill babies in their mother's womb. But the example set by ruling class is always contagious, and it's reasonable to assume that poor women also took contraceptive measures and were given abortive herbs by midwives, only with more difficulty and risk. The Romans, Hebrews, Celts, and early Germans allowed a woman a certain amount of control over her fertility. Thanks to the help of midwives, even though women were subordinated to men and valued mainly for their reproductive capacities, midwives from the earliest times have always advised women on all questions of having to do with childbirth, nursing, contraception, and abortion. In the Middle Ages, their expertise brought them to the hostility of the church. In an attempt to keep mothers away from them, the church forbade the use of traditional remedies that ease the pain of childbirth, claiming that the desire to ameliorate such suffering contradicted with the will of God. Mythology, as usual, served as justification. When God banned Eve from paradise, did he not lay a curse on her and her descendants, namely to suffer when bringing forth children? The desire to ease this pain is therefore an offense against God, and consequently, midwives should not help women. Priests took this curse seriously. In 1591, a Scots noblewoman, Euphemie MacCalne, was burned alive for having asked a midwife for drugs to ease her labor pains. Until the end of the 19th century, priests discouraged doctors from studying the causes of puerperal fever, the major cause of death among new mothers, because the church considered these deaths an expression of God's judgment or punishment for some hidden immorality. When chloroform and ether were discovered, the physician James Simpson proposed to use them in cases of difficult labor. The church once again raised a hue and cry. A Protestant minister in New England wrote, for example, "Chloroform is an instrument of Satan who appears to offer women a blessing, but in reality it threatens to harden society and deprive God of the deep and urgent cries of women who call on him for help in their time of need." One wonders where the church fathers got the idea that a woman's anguish cries were pleasing to God, a pleasure that mustn't be taken from him. It was Queen Victoria, Puritan though she was, who finally silenced the churchmen, although she allowed her doctor to administer chloroform during the birth of her 8th child. When a queen speaks, God speaks. The church changed its attitude immediately, allowing the queen to interpret God's will in her own way. But it was as queen, not as woman, that Victoria won the day. The suffering of ordinary women hadn't managed to arouse the compassion of the churchmen, but the reprimand of a powerful monarch got through to them. Despite church bans and the often violent repression of women and midwives, the history of the Middle Ages shows that couples took the risk of practicing contraception and abortion because they couldn't leave the number of births to chance. A study of birth and death registers by the historians Bonnie Anderson and Judith Zenisser shows that in 1427 in Tuscany, for example, the number of children per family corresponded directly to the economic curve and existing survival conditions. A poor couple living in the mountains generally had one child during their marriage. A more prosperous couple living on the plains could afford an average of 3 or 4. Families limited to births by means permitted by the church, namely to marry late or not at all. Thus, beginning in the 9th century, the census in Germany shows only 28.6% of the population marrying. In the north of France, at Saint-Germain-des-Prés, it was 43.9%. At Saint-Rémy-de-Rheims, 33.4%. Couples took in adult brothers and sisters on condition that they would not marry, so as not to divide the property. By the end of the 16th century, statistics are more numerous and more precise, and they demonstrate how the age at which people married affected the curves of birth and corresponded exactly to the existing economic situation. In the English village of Coyleton, for example, from the 16th to 19th century, The average age for marrying goes from 27 years in 1560 to 30 in 1647, again 30 in 1719, dropping back to 25 around 1837, reflecting once again the prosperity curve of the times. Similarly, the average marriage age in a Tuscan village between 1650 and 1750 went from 21 and a half years to 26 and 1/10 years. Irish families at the end of the 19th century continue to make their own choices. Typically, one boy and one girl in each family had the means to marry, the daughter having to wait until she was 30, the son 28, which tended to limit even further the number of births. When the couple finally married and birth still had to be controlled, they had to practice abstinence for coitus interruptus or any other means of birth control were sinful. Even within legitimate marital relationship, a sexual act that prevented procreation was called fornication. St. Augustine and Thomas Aquinas both condemned the practice of coitus interruptus, despite the priests who came in defense of the poor, pointing out their need to limit births so as not to sink more deeply into poverty. In 1930, Pope Pius forbade contraception in any form despite popular opposition. The position of the Protestant Church was the same as the Catholic Church until the 20th century. But today, most Protestant dominations, fundamentalists accepted, consider contraception to be a moral question for the individual. Fundamentalists of the three great contemporary monotheistic religions, Christian, Jew, and Muslim, are all opposed to contraception, abortion, and the sexual autonomy of women. Nevertheless, couples and women especially have consistently disobeyed the church doctrine ever since the end of the Roman world and the beginning of Christian sexual repression. Apart from marrying late or not at all, women have never stopped using contraceptive methods that they found effective. A cervical cork made of beeswax or a piece of cloth, drinking very cold liquids, remaining passive during intercourse, holding one's breath, hopping in place after the man's ejaculation, vaginal douches or oral potions made of rosemary, coriander, willow leaves, balsam, myrrh, cloves, parsley, animal urine, or vinegar. Peasant women use salt, honey, oil, tar, lead, mint extract, and cabbage seeds for douches or as purgatives, believing them to be effective as spermicides. Ingesting lead or ergot could make a woman permanently sterile, but only at the risk of damaging her health and sometimes losing her life. Still, women continue to use these methods along with the notorious needles or crochet hooks that were used to open up the cervix to trigger an abortion, causing millions of women to bleed to death. When all of the above failed and the unwanted child was born, it was not unusual to send it away directly to a wet nurse in another locality. If family finances then became too tight, the family forgot to send the agreed upon fee to the nurse, who later informed the parents of the death of their child. This practice not only avoided the need to confess infanticide, but made the whole affair less painful, thanks to a psychological detachment from the child taken away at birth. These children abandoned to nurses and then forgotten were mostly girls who would have required dowries and couldn't work the land as well as boys. Girl babies were also neglected by reducing their nursing time at the breast, which often brought on illness and death. The evidence of this kind of selective infanticide is seen in the disproportionate number of girls living in Europe between the 9th and 17th centuries. In normal times, men and women are about even in their number of their youth. Normally, the balance would change later in life as men died in large numbers in wars and crusades, leading to a larger proportion of women in old age. When we see a case such as Saint-Germain-des-Prés in the 9th century, a highly populated area where there was a ratio of 100 women to 115 to 117 men, we must suspect that the practice of infanticide has affected the statistical norm. The lower one goes on the socioeconomic ladder, the more this ratio is outside the norm, reaching 100 women to 133 men in an English village in the 14th century. For the year 1391 to 1392, a list of serfs born on and attached for life to the property of John of Hastings in the south of England shows 46 women for 78 men. By contrast, during a prosperous period in the 13th century, when a peasant couple could feed more children, the population grew accordingly and the ratio of women to men became almost equal. No one will be surprised to learn that the Catholic Church chose to ignore this practice, not because it agreed to give couples, much less women, a certain amount of freedom in these matters, but because it was not without guilt itself. During the 18th and 19th centuries, the church was overwhelmed with the responsibility for babies and children left on the steps of churches. Many of these babies were sent to wet nurses. Only the older ones were kept in orphanages, but no one in the church worried that the mortality rate of the babies left with underpaid or unpaid nurses reached almost unbelievable proportions, up to 75% in the 19th century. These nurses, poverty-stricken themselves, let the babies die when the church stopped the payments. Rather than open up its coffers, the church turned away. Rather than giving women the means of controlling birth, it turned a blind eye to the results of its ideal principles. Children died of starvation, and the nurses were assumed to be incompetent. The babies could die as long as they were baptized. Nothing has changed, really. Today, pro-life groups within and without the Catholic Church pay scant attention to the misery of abandoned children, despite slogans and messages of love to the contrary, and they are prepared to sacrifice the lives of women. They ignore the fact that every year worldwide, an average of 200,000 women, especially poor women, die as a result of clandestine abortions, according to a very conservative report issued by the World Health Organization. To get an idea of the scope of this indifference, let's multiply this number by the 46 years since the end of World War II, when the massacre of 6 million Jews horrified the whole world, and justifiably so, leading people everywhere to examine their consciences. After 46 years, these 200,000 women sacrificed annually to make a total of 9,200,000 women. Did these unnecessary deaths shock the church? No, because women who abort are considered immoral and unclean, as was said of the Jews. Genocide for what is not, if not genocide, is not a sin for Judeo-Christian morality. Abortion is a sin, but the death of millions and millions of women is not. Christianity, Judaism, and Islam are murderous religions for women, and I wonder what world court will have the courage to denounce the murder of women as we denounce other human rights abuses. Let's recall a few simple facts. The universal desire among women to control births expresses today, as it always has, the knowledge that survival depends on the ability to give each child what it needs for its full development, whether it be the survival of a mother, a family, or a community. Mothers are the first to know this because they are, everywhere and always, the first to suffer from scarcity and the first to see their children suffer from it. In research carried out around the world in an effort to understand the ravages of hunger, illness, and poverty, one fact remains constant. Everywhere and in whatever context, women and children are the first to be affected when resources become scarce or are concentrated in the hands of a privileged few. Today, this typically feminine awareness must extend to humanity as a whole. We are beginning to understand collectively that the continued availability of our planet's resources depends on our ability to slow down the population explosion. The reasoning is the same at the global level as with the individual mother who knows she can't allow herself to produce another child without endangering the health of the one she already has. In a book published in 1984, Pranay Gupte, then the research director of the United Nations Fund for Population Activities, concluded after visiting 50 countries that everywhere women want fewer children and men want more because they want more sons. Men's motives range from the most elementary and stupid kind of machismo, and unfortunately very widespread, to a desire for security in old age, with tribal and national pride somewhere in between. Since it's men who control governments, the author says the third world still sees increased population as a sign of strength for a nation, because that mentality is deeply rooted in men's minds. He recalls the First World Conference on Population held in Belgrade in 1964, when the combined strength of the multiple alliances, namely Third World, the Catholic Church, and Communist Bloc, opposed the population control proposals put forth by the United States. In the 20 years since then, the rulers of the Third World nations have been forced to realize that more people mean more mouths to feed and not more riches. But at the same level of the family, the attitude remains the same. The patriarch wants many sons and will not give his wife any freedom of choice. Gupta, who also studied the one-child per family program in China, concludes that draconian measures will have to be imposed on the populations refusing contraception, and that these measures must include, as was not the case in China, community-wide education and reflection on the rights and obligations connected with procreation. I happened to be visiting Caracas, Venezuela, the week after the Pope John Paul II visited. The church's message of go forth and multiply, coupled with its restriction on contraception, suddenly struck me as unbelievably cruel in a city where the numbers of abandoned children increase every year, abandoned by mothers who are themselves poor and exhausted. The cruelty of the message is all the more refined as it is presented under the guise of love. The rich in Caracas, almost everywhere, have access to contraception and can hop on a plane to the United States for an abortion. Was the Pope talking to the poor, already so destitute that they abandon their children? Their suffering is obvious. How many children need to be mistreated, abandoned, or even shot to open his eyes? Today, the United Nations estimates a planetary total of 100 million homeless children without parents, money, or education. And the fundamentalists of every stripe still preach go forth and multiply as a message of love. Until someone decides to send them the bill, or the children themselves, they will not get the point. These leaders behave like irresponsible men who can never quite pay child support for their children, but who buy themselves a luxury car and a fancy condo. They need these, they say, to polish their image and do business. They find it quite natural to let the mothers and the state look after the children. Children are not on their minds. There is only one cure for such irresponsible behavior: to send them the bill, or even better, the children themselves to love and care for. Neither the churches nor the politicians care about the children. They don't care about the mothers. They don't care about the tensions in local communities or the implications of overpopulation for global ecology. At the root of patriarchal religions is the need to control the bodies and souls of women. The minute women are set free, patriarchal institutions crumble. It is a fact of history, and the leaders know it. Sociological research has revealed the connection between overpopulation and ecological disaster. Many reports from different disciplines show the relationship of overpopulation to the abuse of resources, the crowding into ghettos, and the increase in suicides, rapes, and domestic violence. And again, coming full circle, domestic violence leads to absent fathers, abandoned women and children, and increasing poverty. In fact, overpopulation is the most inhuman of scourges because it turns us against each other and destroys all respect for life. In this context, the so-called humanitarian message of fundamentalists of all faiths is very ironic. Produce babies even if they die of hunger. Forbid abortion, but don't give women what they need to feed the children they produce. Dogged by their shadow, the leaders refuse to realize that 95% of the billions of people who will be added to the world population will be born in the poorest countries, the ones already suffering from hunger. These are the same hunger-driven countries presently cut down their forests, abuse their natural resources, and will eventually turn into desert land that might have nourished them. We may as well ask, along with the ecologist John Livingston, to what feast Pope Paul referred when, in 1965, he begged the United Nations not to support population control so that all unborn children might be allowed to participate in the banquet of life. Consider the following figures. Between the year 1 AD and 1650, the rate of growth would anticipate a doubling of population in 2,000 years. The plague was then a powerful controlling agent. Between 1650 and 1850, in 200 years rather than 2,000, the world population doubled again and yet again in 100 years that followed. Today, it is estimated that the global population can double in 35 to 40 years. What kind of power does the church represent in this context? The pro-life message of love carries with it, for all those who fall for it, a cruel reality, a brutal crowding together, which robs everyone of his or her humanity. Give us your sons. Catholic priests used to teach that women who die in childbirth, along with soldiers who die in wartime, can go straight to heaven without confession. Today, Islamic leaders guarantee their soldiers a place in Allah's paradise if they die in a holy war against the devil. The devil may also take the form of American capitalism or women who refuse to submit to the absolute authority of men. This guarantee seems all the more manipulative as it is directed to very young adolescents, barely out of childhood, who don't really understand the nature of their sacrifice. But the horrors of the Islamic fundamentalism are obvious. Our own history of intolerance and the effect it has had on our culture are more easily overlooked. The Judeo-Christian fundamentalist has killed and continues to kill in the name of the faith. The victims are women and children whose suffering fails to attract the media in the way that military action does. It is helpful to recall from time to time this catalog of intolerance. There are abundant examples from the beginning of the history of the church to the present day. A letter attributed to Clement, Bishop of Rome and fourth Pope of 89 to 97, mentions, for example, that anyone refusing to bow his head before the bishops and priests was guilty of insubordination and must be put to death. Pope Innocent I in the 5th century proclaimed that God gave the church the right to kill those who deviated from religious orthodoxy. For 2,000 years, the church blessed mothers for giving life and soldiers, including the soldiers of Christ, for taking it. Equally important to remember are the following words spoken by Martin Luther, a founder of Protestantism. If women become exhausted and die in childbirth, there's nothing wrong with that. Let them die at the moment of birth. They were created for that. One night, I was watching a television documentary with my daughter, then 14 years old, and we were both overcome by the scenes of warfare. Children burned to death, peasants shot in front of their homes, with their children as witnesses, young soldiers barely out of adolescence, forced to dig their own graves, lie in them, and be stabbed to death with knives. Military hospitals filled with hopeless amputees, orphanages full of sad-eyed children who have seen too much, mothers collapsing in grief at the news of another son's death, women who must look after husbands who left in health and returned disabled. My daughter watched this solemnly, realizing how imperfect life is, how lives are being destroyed en masse, everywhere, every minute. This documentary was followed by a news bulletin. A reporter was interviewing a man who brandished a pro-life sign at a demonstration against abortion. The reporter, holding out the microphone, asked him why he was there. The demonstrator stated with much feeling that he was against abortion because it was a crime and an abomination, murder, in fact, to take the life of a human being, even at the fetus level. My daughter's reaction showed me how surprisingly sensible adolescents can be when they consider the adult world. She could neither understand nor accept the horrors shown in the documentary were permissible, legal actions sanctioned and funded by the governments, forgiven and sometimes even blessed by the church. To be allowed to kill men, women, and children who are full of life and fully conscious of suffering, a simple formula is needed: a declaration of war. These same men who decide whether or not to kill in war then dare to talk about crime and murder when a woman sacrifices a fetus no bigger than a raisin and less conscious than a chicken. When women decide to abort, they do so for the sake of principles that are not that different from the ones invoked by the makers of war: freedom, self-determination, issues of dignity as important as one's own survival. The being sacrificed in abortions do not suffer as do the victims of war and ecological disaster. The difference in thinking between the war maker and the anti-abortion demonstrator can best be explained by the division of power over life and death between men and women. Men have the right to kill and destroy, and when the massacre is called a war, they are paid to do it and honored by the actions. War is sanctified, even blessed by our religious leaders. But let a woman decide to abort a fetus that doesn't even have the neurological apparatus to register suffering, and people are shocked. What's really shocking is that a woman has the power to make a moral judgment that involves the choice of life or death. That power has been reserved for men. Any extreme contrast in gender roles implies a division of power between men and women that is absurd for both sexes. Women as life givers, men as war heroes, purveyors of death. In this distribution, women have the power to give life and no right to destroy it, whereas men are absolved for killing, but are dissuaded from loving life, women, and children too much. It is expected that a woman will love and care for all the children she has, that her biologic destiny imposes on her, and that a soldier will be able to kill without flinching. When this kind of polarization is found within a couple, it's definitely a sign that something is wrong, that the two partners are in an unhealthy situation, because the ideal of infinite compassion and generosity in women is as untenable as the perpetually strong and warlike aggressivity of men. When this polarization spreads throughout a culture, warlike aggression reaches its peak. The collective unconscious has always used different ways to reduce the population when resources and space are lacking or when the social climate deteriorates. War is obviously the cruelest means. It occurs inevitably when populations expand dramatically. Overpopulation leads to war, to violence, to the abuse of children that is constant in history. Lives are sacrificed by men rather than by women. But in the war, but in the but in war, the power of death is unleashed in all its fury beyond rationality. War is much more irrational and excessive than exercising the right to abort, and the power of death has been exclusively in the hands of men for far too long. We've become accustomed to thinking that war is as normal that we've lost sight to what it costs in human feeling to give birth to raise, and to love a child with one's whole heart, only to offer it up as cannon fodder. In this context, the return of the ancient goddess Artemis invites us to imagine a new allocation of life and death powers between men and women, an allocation that allows men to appreciate the cost of a life and women to make the decisions based on their mother knowledge. And that concludes part one.